On this week's 51%, Vice President Kamala Harris is on track to become the first woman of color and first person of South Asian descent to earn the Democratic nomination for president, after President Biden's surprising decision to step away from the race. We speak with political science professor Ange-Marie Hancock to get a glimpse at the road ahead.
There is no longer an electoral penalty for women running for office if, again, they roll up their sleeves and do the work.
I'm Jesse King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jesse King. Just a tiny bit of news broke since our last episode. In a presidential race that seems to rapidly change from day to day, Vice President Kamala Harris is likely to become the Democratic nominee after President Joe Biden decided to step down from the race and endorse his VP. Harris, a California senator and attorney general, has been snatching up endorsements from state Democratic parties ahead of the Democratic National Convention. If she does indeed become the nominee, which it very much appears that she will be the first woman of color and first person of South Asian descent to clinch the Democratic nomination for president. So what might her campaign look like, and is America ready to elect its first woman president? To learn more, I spoke with political science professor Ange-Marie Hancock in the days after Biden's announcement. Hancock teaches at The Ohio State University and serves as the academic executive director of its Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. She's also written 3 books on intersectionality and politics among younger generations. And once upon a time, she helped research and design the business model for what would become the WNBA. In recent years, though, she served as the curator of the Kamala Harris Project, a consortium of scholars studying Harris's tenure as the first woman vice president.
So the Kamala Harris Project is a collective of now over 15 scholars who have expertise in a variety of different disciplines. So we've got political scientists, we've got historians, we've got communication scholars, women's and gender studies scholars. We've got a host of different folks. And we came together, basically we launched on January 20th of 2021. We wanted to make sure we dedicated our research expertise to actually studying the first woman of color vice president in United States history. And our analyses are really designed to be kind of nonpartisan, scholarly analyses of what we think is going on, rather than kind of, we're certainly not affiliated with the campaign, or we're not kind of trying to, get her elected per se. This is really about how do we analyze what's going on in this historical moment.
I mean, obviously, I think a lot of people have a good idea of who she is. She's been the vice president for the past 3.5 years now. But, for those who might not be as familiar with her political career so far, what has that resume looked like? What has her experience been up until now?
Yeah, so Kamala Harris got her start in California politics. Of course, she was born in Oakland, California, so that's part of the reason why California has been her home. And she actually took a non-traditional route to getting into politics for a woman. Most times when we talk about women in politics, very often in the United States, they run for kind of legislative office, right? So they run for a school board or a city council or state senate or, even Congress, obviously. And they kind of ladder up that way. But she actually was a district attorney. So she worked through the prosecutor's office, serving 2 terms as the district attorney for the city of San Francisco. And then she ran statewide for attorney general, where she had a number of different high profile opportunities. And then she actually ran for Senate, which is what she was, kind of doing. She was a sitting senator from California when then Vice President Biden selected her to be vice presidential candidate for his ticket.
Well, looking at some of the bigger issues in this year's election so far, I mean, there's been a lot of talk around abortion and reproductive health care, as well as things like immigration and crime. Where has Harris historically stood on some of those issues?
So Vice President Harris's position on reproductive rights and on abortion access as part of what it means to get medical care for women actually comes out of a long-standing concern that she has had for maternal health. So this was something that she focused on with regard to her Senate time, as well as kind of, more recently during her time in the Biden administration. So, when we've seen her go around to different states, right? So kind of after the fall of Dobbs, she has made it one of her kind of signature efforts as vice president. The Biden administration tapped her to be that person that goes around and listens to women's stories about the denial of care that they're able to get with regard to either pregnancies that need to be terminated or miscarriage, care or other kinds of things that have been really negative for women in the fall since the fall of Dobbs. But the concern and the, kind of focus on maternal health and particularly the racial disparities in maternal health outcomes, right? So the fact that, Black women are so much more likely to die in childbirth or to have negative health outcomes that then lead to their death postpartum, immediately postpartum in the weeks and months after, are really kind of something that she's been concerned about for a very long time. I also want to say a little bit about the immigration piece. Certainly, California was one of the places and the states that during her time did become much more accepting of undocumented immigrants. Now, most of those policy changes did occur at the legislative level, so they weren't necessarily attorney general kinds of issues. But certainly in terms of collaboration with ICE, for example, and other kinds of things that would be more of a state federal collaboration between the Attorney General's office. She's always had a position that was much more welcoming towards immigrants and understanding of, again, the reasons why people end up in the situations that they end up in, rather than taking that kind of very punitive, deportation heavy approach to immigration.
Is there an issue that you've seen her change on the most over the course of her career?
That's a really good question. What's been interesting to watch is I don't know that she has changed, but we as a culture have changed. And so some of the things that perhaps, 20 years ago when she was a district attorney and criminal justice system, were seen as, kind of way liberal and way over to the left and things like that. Now, I think the rest of the country has kind of caught up with her. And they're actually wondering, kind of, do we even push further, right, than some of the things that she did. So, for example, when she was working on marijuana policies and looking at drug convictions and things like that, she was one of the first to really start to talk about being what she called smart on crime, rather than being, kind of tough or soft on crime, right? She wanted to talk about, there's a combination of the two that allows us to think about, how do we engage with folks who are drug offenders in a way that doesn't kind of lock them away and throw away the key, but also doesn't allow them to keep continuing to harm communities at the same time, right? And so, some of the things that you've seen President Biden do now, whether it's, pardoning or forgiveness of what's been done by folks who have committed federal drug law, are the kinds of things that she was kind of working on 20 years ago. So, of course, again, as we think about what's happened with Black Lives Matter and a host of other kinds of criminal justice reform solutions, I think the country has kind of moved past some of those solutions. But I think that's a really good example of how she had some innovative solutions that kind of launched the conversation. So I would kind of frame her as an early adopter rather than a changing of her opinion on certain kinds of things.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about how her potential opponent is taking the news, former President Donald Trump. How have you seen the Trump campaign targeting Harris so far? Because now they have to switch their gears from criticizing President Biden to now over to Harris, most likely.
Sure. So I think there were a couple of notable things that happened even before kind of President Biden, declined to run and endorsed Vice President Harris to run. Last week at the Republican National Convention, there were what we now would call, in 2024 language, microaggressions, right? It was very interesting and notable. And some members of the media actually pointed this out that, there were a number of folks who were speakers at the convention on the first day, so the Monday of the convention. And Vice President Harris's first name, Kamala, was pronounced correctly. And then as you got to Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there seemed to be a decline in the ability to pronounce her name correctly, right? And so things like that are things that I would expect to continue, sadly. But I think they are where it really makes sense for us to look at Vice President Harris as a kind of intersectional candidate, right? So part of mispronouncing her name is very much to make her sound as foreign or as not familiar to voters as possible. And then you get to the Trump campaign itself, and you start to hear very much things about her qualifications and the work that she was tapped to do on immigration during the Biden administration, right? And really trying to clearly tie her to the immigration kinds of pieces, right? The last part of what I will say about the Trump campaign, one of the important pieces with regard to what the Trump campaign has already started to do is to very much kind of use Trump's signature mocking style, right? So whereas, in the past, he would say things like crooked Hillary Clinton, crooked Joe Biden, et cetera, right? He was talking about laughing Kamala Harris, and really trying to kind of mock her as being someone, not worthy of respect. There's very much this effort to kind of undermine people taking her seriously as a candidate. And there's been, I would say, decades of research that kind of back up the idea that women are not always taken as seriously as candidates as men are.
I was going to ask on that front, like what kinds of obstacles do you see women candidates, and specifically women of color candidates, having to face on the campaign trail? What is Harris going to have to continue to juggle if she does in fact become the nominee? In just the past couple of days, something that has stirred up a lot of drama that I've noticed online was just, old comments from Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, where he criticized Harris and some other candidates for being childless cat ladies, basically. That being because she's a stepmom and hasn't given birth herself, which, technically when you think about it, I mean, there have been past male presidents who haven't had biological children, including, George Washington. So it seems like comments that women typically get, but now you also have to deal with them while you're running for office.
Yes, I would definitively agree that the stepmom versus being a biological mom to children, I think is something that is kind of on that, I would say bullying kind of side of politics, right? So that's why you hear those kinds of just very mean things, right? And if you think about, again, not to harp on the maternal health side of things, but if you think about like all of the different families and the ways in which families get constructed in the United States these days, right? How many, blended families there are. It was surprising to me that they would come out and say, well, she's just a stepmom. She's not she's never been a biological mother. So why would she care about the United States? Just seemed to me very kind of tone deaf to just the reality of many, 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 many women's lives in the United States, right? There are millions of stepmoms out there, and I would say adoptive moms and foster moms, and, we could kind of go on and on and on about that. I think the other thing it does, though, to talk about the research that has really looked at the kinds of things that women candidates face, right? It really starts to question her womanhood. There is very much this push in a certain part of the Republican Party, the part that is very much an evangelical component, that really celebrates motherhood and a particular kind of motherhood, right? It needs to be a biological motherhood. It needs to be a motherhood that is more retiring from the public eye to focus on, raising children, right? So there's been a meme going around on social media about being, a trad wife, right? A traditional wife. And so I think part of those comments are certainly designed to appeal to that constituency. But I think some of them are just really downright mean, not knowing, of course, anyone's medical history in the sense of whether or not this has been something that's been a struggle for an individual. The other piece of what I'll say with regard to the research on what women candidates have traditionally faced, women candidates have traditionally faced higher hurdles in terms of the standards by which they've been judged in order to actually get into office. And what's been ironic about that is that once women surpass those hurdles, they tend to be just as popular as male candidates for office. And one of the classic cases in point of this is actually former Secretary and Senator Hillary Clinton. She was very much lambasted as a first lady. She was very much criticized, when she was running for president in 2016 and also in 2008, before, Barack Obama won the nomination. There was very much this kind of, vitriol directed towards her. But what was really interesting about the case was when she was elected as the senator of New York, people actually developed a tremendous amount of respect for her. Her constituents actually really enjoyed, and I say actually not because it's surprising to me personally, but I think a lot of scholars were surprised because of the level of vitriol during the campaigns and during the, kind of push for elections, and how much that died down in many ways when she went to the Senate as an actual elected official. So I think the barriers definitely happen much more during the campaign versus when women get in office. And then the second thing that's really important to think about is we kind of have two stereotypes coming together when women candidates are running. So the first set of stereotypes that we often carry around in our head is, what does it mean to be a leader, right? And we think of leaders as competent, we think of them as strong, we think of them as brave, we think of them as, people who are going to get things done and go-getters and ambitious. And those tend to be, even to this day in 2024, personality traits that we tend to associate with men. And we don't necessarily associate them with women, right? So the stereotypes, of course, we have of women: compassionate, relational, friendly, warm, nurturing, right? A whole host of stereotypes. So when a woman candidate runs for office, what ends up happening is those two stereotypes collide in some folks' brains. And it's like, well, they're a woman, but they're also a leader. And we're not quite sure how to actually understand that, right? Even in this day and age. And that's something that happens in lots of other countries too. But what ends up happening is that creates a gap, right, in people's willingness to kind of say, okay, I know about this person and I have an opinion about this person and whether or not I want to vote for them. And that's where disinformation can come in. That's where you can get, characterizations of women of color candidates in very kinds of just like highly sexualized, deeply disrespectful and misogynistic, kinds of things. So you have, she's both African-American and Asian American. So there are all kinds of very misogynistic sexual images circling around on social media, that are designed to kind of embrace both the stereotypes of Black women as being highly sexualized and the stereotypes of Asian American women as being exotic sexual objects of desire. And so I think that's also a problematic hurdle, because now the campaign has to figure out how to address that instead of focus on the issues.
We're speaking with Ange-Marie Hancock, a political science professor at The Ohio State University and curator of the Kamala Harris Project, studying Harris's tenure as the first woman vice president. Now Harris is on track to become the first woman of color Democratic nominee for president. Ange-Marie, I guess I kind of have the big question for you now, which is America ready to elect its first woman president? One thing I've been seeing online over the past week or so, and even from some people in my own life, there seems to be this nervousness that, especially after Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, that maybe America isn't ready, or that, this somehow makes Harris a risky candidate as a result. What do you make of that question and of that argument?
Yeah, I think there are kind of two takes on that. From the research, we certainly know that women of color are electable, and women are electable more broadly. Folks who are concerned about that, and I'm talking about folks in the general public who are concerned about that, that is an effort to redouble, right, your efforts. That's a signal that you want to redouble your efforts and get out there and do as much as you personally can, rather than kind of sit at home and say, oh, I'm nervous, I'm worried about this, right? If Kamala Harris is your candidate and you want to see her get elected and you are afraid that other folks will not vote for her, right? Then be part of the solution rather than, simply worry about it at home and say, I'm going to cast my vote, but I'm just really nervous about it. I think the second thing I would say is for those folks is that there's another take that's been circulating that really talks about there is now no longer an electoral penalty for women running for office if, again, they roll up their sleeves and do the work, and then also the folks who support them roll up their sleeves and do the work. Actually, she's won 3 elections, right? So she's won her elections for attorney general. She's won her elections for district attorney. She's won her elections for senator. And technically, she was part of the victory for President Biden in 2020, right? So let's call that 3.5 elections, if you will. So I think that's, the other thing to think about is that, when folks take a look at her record of actually winning elections, that may be an effective counter to the idea that people are nervous. And she has won as herself. And so I think a lot of times folks will say, well, Hillary Clinton won because of Bill Clinton. While I don't think the evidence bears that out, I don't think you have that same kind of concern about a Kamala Harris because, of course, she ran as herself and did not have either a famous spouse or a famous father, which is often how women get into politics.
Well, let's talk about that work then. How do you view Harris's ability to pull in voters? Of course, on the night Biden stepped down and endorsed her, we saw record-breaking levels of fundraising for Harris. As has made headlines, a Zoom call of about 44,000 Black women got together and raised more than $1.5 million in just a few hours. But something Democrats have been trying to do on this campaign is also stir up young voters and white women too, because Pew Research polls show white women voted more for Trump in 2016 and in 2020. So how do you view Harris's ability to, connect with these groups and to get it together in these next 100 days?
So with regard to Black voters, I do think that the polling so far that we've seen, and again, the polling was much more hypothetical, so we'll see what happens, kind of going forward. The polling has shown that she's more likely to hold on to Black voters. She's more likely to hold on to younger voters. And so with regard to those two constituencies, the fact that they are excited, the fact that they are engaged, I know that there's a Gen Z meme going around about her that's, again, kind of approving of her and excited about her. I think those are things that will then drive, voters to the polls, right? And that will then drive voters to get engaged in the campaign, do the volunteering, the donating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think the idea of her positions on reproductive rights, I think, ironically, even though it was, the opponent's campaign that brought it up, the fact that she is in this modern family as a stepmom, who has an accomplished career of her own, got married later in life. I think all of those things make her much more relatable to an important constituency, the suburban moms. When we're talking about suburban voters or voters who might have, been Democratic, but then crossed to vote for Trump in 2016 and did not vote for a woman candidate, in the guise of Hillary Clinton, I think one thing that makes Kamala Harris stand out a little bit differently from Clinton is that as a former prosecutor, she has actually focused on fighting crime as a huge part of her political career, both as district attorney and state attorney general. We know from some of the research that suburban voters tend to factor crime into their voting calculus much more frequently than perhaps other voters do. Other voters might have, other issues at the top of their head or the top of their mind. And so, when you put her against the alternative of former President Trump, there's a lot of speculation that she will be able to kind of draw those voters in, first because of crime, and then second, because of the work that she's been doing around reproductive rights, right, and reproductive freedom, and helping people understand that under her administration, there would be kind of protection for IVF, and protection for miscarriage care and some of the other kinds of maternal health issues. So I think those two things are what's going to draw suburban voters to her in a way that perhaps former Secretary Clinton was not able to draw those suburban women voters.
Well, Ange-Marie, thank you so much for taking the time. If Harris indeed becomes the nominee, what are you watching for over the next few months?
I think there will be far more interest in the debates than there would have been now that she is going to be debating former President Trump. So I will be watching those debates to see just how the response is to her in real life, right? So not just how former President Trump responds once the debate is happening, but also how voters and, the general public who are watching the debate, how they respond to her, and whether or not they are kind of going towards more of the stereotypes and things that, we've already discussed, or whether they're going to, kind of think of her in a new way, because again, she's got so many identities associated with her that it's difficult to kind of say she's just a woman, she's just an African American, she's just an Asian American.
Ange-Marie Hancock is a professor of political science at The Ohio State University and the academic executive director of its Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. She's also the curator of the Kamala Harris Project, a consortium of scholars studying Harris's tenure as the first woman vice president. She's also written 3 books, including The Politics of Disgust, Solidarity Politics for Millennials, and Intersectionality, an Intellectual History. You can learn more about her work at osu.edu. Thanks for listening to this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop on all of WAMC's shows by signing up for our weekly newsletter, Airwaves, at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King, 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool, no electricity, hot rain on the concrete, sweet melting little girl dreams. They said, oh, I want a big life, not a house that could have been life. Where are you taking me? Where are you taking me?